I would now like to welcome you back to Henry Corrali for our chair today. Henry has formerly been a World Bank country director and a professor at the University of Birmingham, and he works for HVT. Thank you, Henry.
Thank you very much. Really looking forward to this session, and we do have a very rich panel this morning here. The title of this session, Unlocking Pathway to Low-Carbon Transport in African Cities Without Compromising Economic Growth, really means trying to tackle the nearly 1/4 of CO2 emissions that are related to transport. Of course, making an inroad into this requires that we are more efficient in reducing carbon emissions from transport in general, which means that for African countries, although their current emission levels are relatively low, they still need to grow. So the issue is, can they grow by adopting a low carbon growth track for the future? This session is intended to explore all these options in the various parts of the transport sector. We'll be looking at urban transport in particular and how various modes of transport can adopt low carbon emissions. So without much further ado, let me turn to our speakers and presenters. We have 4 presentations. The first one will be by Bronwyn Thornton from Walk21, who is online. Second presentation will be by Gary Herc, who is here, and Romano Opio, who is online, I believe, from Nairobi. The third session will be by Clive Roberts, who is here in person. And then finally, we have a double act from Francis Mwangi and from Esther Gachanja. So I will introduce each one ahead of their presentations. So first, Bronwyn Thornton is CEO of Walk21 Foundation. Walking, as we all know, is perhaps the mode of transport that is most used in African cities, and yet it is overlooked when considering planning infrastructure in several cities. So without stealing your thunder, Bronwyn, over to you. We have 15 minutes for each presentation, if possible, and if there are any burning questions, we will then take those immediately, but otherwise we'll have maybe 20 minutes at the end for an open discussion. Over to you, Bronwyn.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to the HVT program for the invitation today. I'm really pleased to be joining a conversation about economic growth and bringing walking into that conversation. So I provocatively titled my presentation, Can People Walking Save the Planet? Or perhaps even save the economy? There we go, let's keep the sound on. Let's start with why walking matters, and particularly why it matters for urban transport. And the great news is we don't have to decarbonize walking. We are already the carbon-free mode. And continents like Africa already have an advantage in that they haven't heavily invested in traditional carbon-heavy modes of transport. So you have this great opportunity with your high mode share of walking to bring in energy efficient public transport services, get your low carbon public transport services in. Walking underpins that. It gives you the fiscal viability for those services. It's energy efficient, it's low cost, so that's key to a just transition for everybody. And once you move outside all of the fantastic, valuable transport benefits of walking, we then move into public health, reduced congestion, safer streets, and more vitality in our cities. So let's not make those mistakes and heavily motorize and then have to undo that, like is happening in many parts of the world. And if you think walking doesn't have something to offer here, we have calculated that potentially 60% of trips worldwide could be met by walking. But how is walking valued in Africa? I've mentioned already that the ambition in northern countries is to increase walking, and the challenge in Africa is to retain this walking mode share. Now, I don't have any delusions that we're going to retain it at the percentage levels that currently exist, but we must put more value on walking and its contribution to our urban environments, our transport systems, and the climate agenda, to ensure we don't miss the benefits that we've talked about already. So we did a piece of research for the high volume transport program to find out what were the attitudes amongst government decision makers about walking. What did they think about walking, and had COVID had any impact on that as well? And sad to say, they didn't see it as particularly relevant to economic progress, which is the subject of this conversation. How does 3 meters of walking paths help me generate economic wealth? And even yesterday, in a conversation about funding active travel, I heard somebody actually say, we don't get a return on investment for walking. And it was a very disappointing, actually, to hear that said, because the return on investment for walking comes from a broader perspective. The risk is low, the return is high. If we measure the benefits across the full transport system, the social and economic systems, our local economies, and our public health systems. But we are caught in fitting traditional success criteria. So people don't see the value of walking because we've historically valued travel time and the need to reduce travel time in our journeys, as opposed to valuing the quality of that journey. Other key findings was that what we know and understand about walking is dominated by a vehicle-centric perspective, which suggests that putting in a pedestrian overpass like this one is a great solution for pedestrians, but it's actually just a vehicle solution to ensure the rapid movement of traffic through that space, rather than the prioritized movement of people. And this is a great quote. I'll leave you to read the quote, but it's that difference between policy and what's implemented on the ground. Are we making those links, and are we getting that right yet? And I'll come back to this in a minute. And finally, is what we're doing responsive to the needs? Are people actually being involved in their decisions about how their environments are built, maintained, and delivered for urban mobility? This set of research, we came up with a set of recommendations, which I don't have time to share with you in full at the moment, but it was about capacity building, about building in the values of walking into our cost-benefit analysis systems. It's about growing the policy base and broader community engagement. And what I want to show with this presentation today is how that piece of research is translating across all of the work that we're doing at Walk 21 to build momentum for walking as a mode, as part of this pathway for economic growth and a sustainable mobility future. So with the support of the UN Habitat and UN Environment, we worked on this report, which is Walking and Cycling in Africa, Evidence and Good Practice to Inspire Action. It was in finding local actions and interventions to retain, protect, and enable people to walk and cycle, to inspire others to do the same thing. So we collected a range of case studies and did a lot of data analysis to inform this report. And I highly recommend you reading this if you want to think about walking and cycling in Africa. Because the reality is 78% of people walk for transport every day to reach essential services. Like I said at the beginning, this is a mode share that we don't have ambitions to retain forever, but we mustn't just squander it entirely with a misplaced focus on motorization, because with increasing motorization comes all sorts of other problems. They only have 3% of the world's registered vehicles, but 20% of global road traffic deaths. We see declining health as a result of poor air quality, and we see terrible road safety data. It's the least safe place to walk and cycle in the world. So motorization is not the golden solution that people have historically believed it, and we must avert that risk. And walking and cycling in Africa, though, despite those numbers, it's unsafe and it's uncomfortable. 95% of roads in Africa fail to provide an acceptable level of service for people walking, and 93% an acceptable level for cycling. We are just not valuing these modes in our communities. And the critical one on a transport and decarbonisation agenda is the link to public transport systems, because we've strongly believe that if you decarbonize your public transport systems and you build walkable catchments, so when you invest in public transport, you invest in walkable catchments, then we have a system, an urban environment that actively invites people to choose sustainable mobility options. So there's a lot of challenges. We found a lot of evidence that we'd like to, that I've shared, but I don't want this to be a gloomy session, because actually there's lots of inspiring action, and that's what that report captures. There's lots of good things happening. And 59% of people walking and cycling in Africa are supported by a policy. But as we saw in one of those previous slides, the policy is not always having the impact that we might want to see. Which brings me to the next piece of framing about how we bring walking into that conversation to design that pathway for sustainable mobility. And that's the development that UN Environment is undertaking. We are a technical partner for, is the Pan-African Action Plan for active mobility. And this is what it says: 54 countries across Africa engaged in developing national walking policies and signing up to a range of commitments to deliver better environments, better streets, and better public spaces for active mobility. This process we are also engaged with at a European level, pan-European level, growing the expectation that national governments have a responsibility for delivering better streets and public spaces for people on foot. And this process is going to unfold over the next year, engaging a diverse range of stakeholders, including those all-important financiers and people who do the economic appraisals for schemes and to make decisions about investments, the community, the policymakers, the technicians, and those all-important decision makers. Because as part of that report process, we've been building the platform called the Pathways for Walkable Communities and capturing the data that we know and that we have about walking around the world, putting a walking lens on the available data and identifying those key performance indicators that those available data sets tell us about the state of walking in countries around the world. We're bringing the knowledge we have to our national governments because we're tired of people saying, oh, we don't have any data, we don't know what to do. And this is what this building of these resources pinned on that original piece of research to answer the questions people have is all about. So we took data from the World Health Organization about safety and activity levels. We took data from IRAP around comfort and infrastructure, and data from the UN Habitat around access to public transport, that 11.2 from the SDGs that measures proximity to public transport. And we did our own looking at the available policies that are there and came up with these 5 indicators. But what's missing from this, and this is really critical, because when people talk about walking in Africa, oh, people only do it out of necessity or out of poverty, if the environment's horrible and therefore we all have to give them an alternative. That alternative is good environments for walking. But how will we know when we've succeeded? And that's customer satisfaction. And we've developed an app, Walkability app, does what it says on the tin, to help people actually assess their environments and report back to their cities how they are experiencing their walking environments. This is a map from Dublin, but we've done this in Lagos and in Colombia and another number of cities, supported by the Alston Foundation, to get that direct feedback from customers and not only map where the problems are, which you can see here, but come back and measure success after interventions have actually happened. So this way we're translating right down to street level from those national policies, those global data sets, to the customer satisfaction on the street. Because the pathway to economic growth and sustainable mobility is walkable cities, dense, compact, connected, walkable cities supported by low carbon public transport systems. If we hit SDG 11.2 with 500 meters, with high percentages of people living within 500 meters of public transport, let's not stop at public transport. Let's have people within 500 meters of key places where they need to go. And this is where you get the economic return, because people don't have to invest too much of their personal budgets or their transport, the government's transport budgets in long distance travel. We can localize and achieve the same results. That's it from me. My last thing to say is that I'm delighted to share with you that we are going to be in Kigali next year for the Walk 21 conference. It's the 23rd edition of the Walk 21 conferences. This will be our first in Africa, and we are absolutely looking forward to continuing this conversation in about October next year. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Bronton. We do have questions already on the Slido, if you care to look at that, but we'll come back at the end when we have a general discussion. So in the meantime, I would encourage everyone else out there, please use the Slido. I think the code is 2715656 for this session. Our next speakers are Romanus Otieno Pio, joining us online from Nairobi, and Gary Hack, who's here next to me. Romanus is the program leader for sustainable urbanization at SEI Africa, and Gary is a senior research associate at SEI at the University of York. Both have been working on the HVT project to develop guidelines for inclusive climate-resilient transport planning in Africa. So without much further ado, I believe, Gary, you're going first, and then you'll lead the way.
Thank you. If you could just show the presentation first. Yeah. So while we're waiting, I'll just introduce myself. My name's Gary Hack, and I'm from the Stockholm Environment Institute at the University of York. Today, I would like to give a presentation on a project that we've been doing, funded by the UK aid FCDO on inclusive climate resilient transport planning in Africa. We did that in collaboration with the Zambia Road Safety Trust, the UN Environment Programme, and colleagues in Uganda at the University of Makerere. So the title of the presentation is Creative Participatory Approaches for Inclusive Climate Resilient Transport. Just to give you, if you've never heard of SEI, SEI is the Stockholm Environment Institute. We're a global organization working on environment development issues. Our mission is to bridge the gap between science and policy to achieve change for a more sustainable future. We have offices around the world. Our headquarters is in Stockholm, and we have offices in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and based within the University of York in the UK. So following on from Bronwyn's presentation on walking, when we talk about this transition to low-carbon transport, we need to talk about a just and equitable transition, a transition to transport that includes and meets the mobility needs of everyone. But we also know that there are many vulnerable groups, such as women, older persons, the young and people with disabilities, who tend to be disproportionately affected by mobility challenges. And we need to place that within the context of a changing climate and how their mobility will be affected when it comes to extreme weather events and whether they're walking or cycling. Part of this project was on the inclusive climate resilient transport planning in Africa. Our objective was to address this challenge. How can we incorporate the voice of disadvantaged groups in the transport planning process to ensure more inclusive climate resilient transport in African cities for the future? And at this point, I would like to show the video. Thank you. So the video there showed a number of the challenges that people face in African cities every day, getting around, walking, cycling, and also showed the range of different approaches that we've used to try and include their voice in the transport planning process. And as part of this project, we produced a guidance document to help transport decision makers and transport planners, as well as representative of disadvantaged groups, to make them aware of the approaches available to include their voice in the transport planning process. Could you go back to my presentation, please? So here are some of the approaches that we looked at: deliberative approaches, participatory mapping, infrastructure experiments, narratives, streetscape models, digital stories, and placemaking activities. And all these are listed and developed further in our reference guide, which is available online from the HVT Transport Links website. So in terms of how we applied some of these approaches, we worked in Zambia and Uganda, trying to test and apply to see how these approaches work in practice and the challenges and the benefits of such approaches. So, for example, with the deliberative approaches, we used a Delphi survey, and with that, we were able to gain consensus between transport planners and representative disadvantaged groups of where their challenges are when it comes to transport. Also, with regard to transport resilience within a city, we used a spatial element there, and how the opinions changed and where in certain areas of the city you could focus on for infrastructure development. So this approach, again, allows to build consensus to identify common areas where action could be taken in the transport planning process. Another aspect is digital storytelling. Now, within the video, you saw different people, and they were interviewed and filmed using digital storytelling. And here, it's a way of getting to understand the story of people's mobility and how they get from A to B, and the daily challenges they face. So this lady here, you can see she's lost a leg, and she did that. She uses a boda driver in Uganda. She actually had an accident using this mode of transport, and she lost a leg. Yet, in the video explaining her challenges that she faced, she still feels the need to use the boda driver in order to get around. So despite being injured by that, she still continues to use that mode of transport. Another picture you saw with it in the video was a man, an older man carrying refuge. Again, we talked to him about his mobility challenges. He was once a civil servant. He had a road traffic accident. He couldn't work. He lost his job. And now he deals with refuge every day. And he walks everywhere. And he still today faces the challenges of walking and transport. So these digital storytelling is a way to communicate to people the challenges an individual might face who has a disability or a particular vulnerable group every day, and how you can communicate that to transport decision makers and planners. Another one is participatory mapping, and again we did this in Zambia, and you saw in the video some people on the roadside. It's a way of talking to people about how they're challenged by a particular mode of transport. In that case, it was along a key road. We were talking to women and children going to school, and that was able to identify particular hotspots where action could be taken, where interventions could be taken to improve the whole urban environment experience. And another one which we explored was infrastructure experiments. And here we introduced a 3D zebra crossing in Zambia, and this was quite successful. We had very good feedback from the users. It felt safer. We measured the traffic and the speed of the traffic, and that slowed down, and we were able to, because of doing this pilot, a number of these 3D zebra crossings were used and installed within Zambia after this project. So what we did then is to look at these different methods, and then to see how they can convey the voice of disadvantaged groups to transport planners, how they can convey their mobility challenges. So we did that in Uganda and in Zambia. And now I'd like to pass over to my colleague Ramanas in Nairobi, who will talk about some of the activities he undertook in Nairobi and some of the participatory techniques he used.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks, Tim, for that presentation. Yes, just taking to one of the methods of narratives, which is basically engaging the participants in terms of their felt needs about a specific local context. It's more of a face-to-face interaction between the experts and the users to get their perceptions about what are some of the issues which they face with regard to their mobility experience, which is which also contributes to digital stories. But you see this, maybe you don't have a video, but you're able to visualize and pick the concerns of the person who maybe wants to give their personal experience and account of how they move around. Next slide, Larry. Yes, in terms of streetscape, it's more of a 3D model. This is more for visualization, because at times when you just talk and don't give people images, they might not be able to understand the dynamics and the challenge they might be going through. And you see, this is very important, especially because, most of the working spaces are contested spaces, because you have traders and you have other people who have the same interest in that particular space. So streetscapes give them an opportunity to see how do you accommodate the needs of different people, the traders and the workers. And this is what we did in Nairobi, Luthuli, with partnership with the UNEP, UN Habitat, and the City County of Nairobi. And I know Francis and Esther, since they're in the room, they can attest to this in terms of how this changed the perception of what's happening in Luthuli. Thank you. Next. The placemaking activities, actually, this is also, again, the Luthuli Avenue, which was a motorized street. But after the placemaking activities, where you try to demonstrate practically by closing the street and engaging and looking at how things will look like for the business people and for the workers, and whether is it acceptable way of changing the street. So placemaking is just a test to test the actual, if this thing was to actualize, like closing this place for motorized transport, how will it look like? And this really succeeded, because this led to making Luthuli a motorized space where we reduced motorization in this particular place. And there was an evaluation which was done, I think around 2 years ago, just to note what are the changes. So there was positive feedback in terms of business people noting that there's increased business, because people shop when they're walking, they don't shop when they're in cars. So this has had a very positive impact, which is economic, which this particular session is keen on. And of course, it also led to low carbon emissions in that particular, because they are reduced motorization in that particular place. Thank you.
Thank you. So together, all these methods and approaches that we tested, if we are going to have a just transition, if we are going to retain non-motorized modes of transport such as walking and cycling, we need to create a better urban environment experience, an experience that meets the needs of everybody, and especially the vulnerable groups. But at the same time, we need to consider how we can adapt our infrastructure to make it more resilient to future climate impacts. How will hotter weather or flooding affect infrastructure that might prevent a vulnerable user from walking or cycling? As part of the guide that we developed under this SCDO program, we've outlined a kind of decision support system to help planners to decide, how to use these different methods. There's pros and cons of each method. Some methods will probably not be relevant for certain projects. Other methods will be. So we see this as a kind of first step into raising awareness that there are ways that can be taken to understand the mobility needs of different diverse groups, but also how to do that. So this is our first step. So for the guidance document, I would like you to encourage you all to go and download it and have a read for yourself. And you can do that from transportlinks.com. So thank you.
Thank you very much to Romanus and to Gary for the very excellent and exciting presentation. Again, there are a number of questions already on the Slido. What I'd suggest for those of you out there, if you don't want to put a question, maybe you can like some of those that have already been posed, and we'll pick those that are most liked to be responded to before we end. Now, our third speaker is Clive Roberts, who is Professor of Railway Systems and Head of the School of Engineering at University of Birmingham, my old university as well. He's the Director for the Center for Railway Research and Education, which has been working with industry on hydrogen fuel technology, exploring the potential for use to transform rail transport across the globe. I'm very eager to hear about this. Over to you, Clive.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody here in the room and online. So if we can put up my slides, I'm going to be talking today about a project very much focused on railway technology and how the deployment of innovative railway technology in Africa, particularly in low-income countries in Africa, can help to make a step change and a rapid adoption of innovative technology for decarbonisation. So, as has been said, I'm Clive Roberts. I'm head of the School of Engineering and Professor of Railway Systems. And I lead this project, which is again part of the UK aid funded by the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office in the UK and as part of the high volume transport activities. So I lead what's called the Birmingham Centre for Railway Research and Education. We have about 150 researchers in my centre working on all aspects of railway policy, technology, systems in general. And we have very much an international reach to the work we do and we state that we work in all continents across the world apart from the Arctic. And you can see on the map there's a number of active projects around the world that we are currently working on. For the background of this project, this is very much focused on sub-Saharan low-income countries and looking at how they're investing in rail technologies. You may well know that railways are a growing sector in Africa and many other parts of the world, and particularly many other low-income country parts of the world. That's great news from a carbon point of view, and actually from a cost point of view if invested appropriately. Across Africa, there is a drive to try and come up with interoperable standards rather than every country doing its own thing, but that's really quite challenging. So sort of adjacent to the work that I'm talking about today, we're also doing work on supporting railway corridors and ensuring that there's interoperability across a number of the countries that I'm talking about. So the challenge is that today the railways that exist in Africa are powered by diesel engines. And whereby in some other countries in the world, electrification is the way to go. If I think of the UK, we're moving very much towards electrification of our lines, where we've previously had diesel traction. The challenge in Africa is actually the cost is incredibly high. The distances are actually much more significant, so you're working on a cost per kilometre. And actually the power system itself is perhaps not geographically robust enough across the country to be able to provide the power that might be needed by a railway system. Therefore, we need to look at alternative traction methods. And we need to make alternative traction methods that aren't diesel. For those of you who aren't that familiar with railway investments, it's worth bearing in mind that if I was to go and buy a new, say, freight locomotive to run in Africa today, it may well take me 5 years to sort of spec and procure that, and then I'd probably want to be running that locomotive for 45 years. So in 50 years' time, we're still stuck with 2020 type technology. So what we want is that intervention now, while those investments are being made, people to have both the sight of those innovations, understanding how they might apply to their particular railways, and having the confidence to go in a slightly different direction and perhaps having a technology jump. And as you'll see, if that can't be achieved, because that's quite an ambitious aim, it's to ensure that the technology that is invested in is adaptable, and therefore over that life of 40, 50 years that I'm talking about, potentially things could be changed so they become low carbon, decarbonized over that lifetime of the project. So our project is very much about informing people. It's about helping to create local plans. And then, as you'll see, looking at some very, very specific case studies to see and help and influence those initiatives. So what we're looking at is understanding the cost effectiveness of those zero emission novel traction systems for railways in this part of the world. So at the beginning of the project, and this project is still ongoing, as I'll explain towards the end, at the beginning of the project, we engaged with a number of countries, and this really we needed buy-in from the local governments, the local railways, and we needed people that were wanting to invest or had a plan to invest in their railway upgrades. And we picked 4 countries initially from a number that come forward. A commuter service in Uganda, a passenger service over longer distances in Nigeria, a heavy haul freight system in Liberia, and a mixed railway sets of corridors in Tanzania. And again, it's worth perhaps just thinking about these different types of transport, depending on where you come from in the world. You may think, when you think of railways, you think of a particular type of railway, maybe a passenger and urban railway. But in Africa, there is an awful lot of freight being moved by rail. And actually, the growth market driver in many instances is freight. And if you can get the freight system designed correctly, you can then intermix passenger services between it. So we did a capability analysis of these railways and understood what the options might be around some of those technologies, and how we might be able to implement a zero carbon or decarbonised solution. And you can see here there's lots of mathematics and simulations that sit behind this, but that's not the focus of today. The focus is really just to showing that there is a difference, and there's potential to use some of these different technologies. And at this stage, just a maybe, there is potential for that technology jump. So our interim findings were that 3 of our railways, so not the freight railway in Liberia, but the other 3, we could develop a solution which was a decarbonised solution. So we'll come on to freight railways a little bit later on in this, but particularly on that Liberia issue, it's a mining railway with particularly steep gradients, and the solution there is either to stick with combustion engines or particular electrification on those steep gradients. We looked at these solutions and developed them in partnership with those railways, but the Tanzanian examples were the ones that we took forward, particularly because of where Tanzania was in its life cycle of investing in railways and ongoing projects. And just to give you a flavour for that, in 3 weeks' time, we will be delivering a workshop to around 50 people in Tanzania to disseminate more results of this work around the particular case studies I'm about to show you. So we then looked at these railways in Tanzania and started to investigate what the potential was for the particular types of lines. So we actually ended up looking at 3 lines: a commuter line, so a short line, a mixed traffic line, and then a medium distance passenger line. Now, these railways all have different mass of vehicles. They actually have a different volumetric option in terms of like a gauging option that you can fit technologies in. So we did initial design works for each of these railways to basically say what would a train, what would a locomotive look like on these railways, and could we achieve this within the constraints of weight and volume. We also then looked at retrofitting design. So some of these railways may have 10 or 15-year-old rolling stock, which probably have another 30 years of life. And We have lots of experience at the University of Birmingham in retrofitting trains with alternative traction. So actually at COP26 in Glasgow, we demonstrated the UK's first hydrogen train, which was a retrofit of an existing train, a 20-year-old train, which we retrofitted with hydrogen traction. So we know that is a solution that is achievable. And so in some instances, we're talking about new solutions. In some instances, we're talking about taking mid-life rolling stock and ripping out the diesel engines and refitting with some alternative traction solutions. And again, remembering that the objective, the clear objective of this project is to assess and educate around these areas so that these kinds of solutions are put on the table as potential options. As soon as you, within a project, go down a route of committing to a particular traction mode, you're then stuck with that for many decades. So what we want is to put those options on the table early on so this kind of analysis can be done. So retrofitting is one of the stages we looked at, and we're able to look at how both trains could be retrofitted, and there is actually the retrofitting of refueling stations. For example, if you're looking at hydrogen or if you're looking at battery powered trains, it's not the same as refueling a diesel train. So there is actually a whole ecosystem of retrofitting that's needed. And that's quite interesting in its own right, because that can actually, and we've considered this as part of the project, that can create local industries in particular countries and be developed further for particular for particular implementations. So if we look at these particular routes in Tanzania, we're looking at a route from Dar to Kigoma. It's a long route, and these routes are if you refer to how I was talking about the UK, this is a longer route than you would find in the UK. So the kind of railways that we've got here is quite different to perhaps that we would be used to normally in the analysis that we do. So the current train that might be employed on this railway is a large railway, a large locomotive that's diesel powered. A considerable amount of energy is required for the round trip and significant diesel storage. We then looked at two solutions. The hydrogen solution across a particular route, and we concluded through quite a lot of analysis that this would be a viable solution both in terms of the locomotive itself, but also around the ecosystem and the availability of hydrogen generation within the country. And the really interesting thing there is that you can perhaps start with hydrogen that isn't as clean as hydrogen that you would migrate to over time. So you're making that infrastructure decision in terms of the investment in the rolling stock early on, and over its life it decarbonises through the ability to make greener hydrogen. You may have noticed that the diesel train required one diesel stop. We can, with the right planning, route setting, we can use the hydrogen train with one hydrogen stop. We then looked at a solution with a hydrogen tanker afterwards, and that means that we can have no stops, and we can actually get some benefits of a redesign of that solution. So again, the logistics of that were considered, and the options were appraised. So the work, as I say, is ongoing. What we're doing now is working very much in detail of specifying the kind of systems that you might need. I've shown you one example, but in a number of examples of railways, and allowing that technology jump. This is a technology that we're beginning to bring in around the world in many countries. The kind of thing here that we can do in Africa is allow that technology jump to happen, ensure that the investment in the future is decarbonised and is a sound investment. There are costs associated with this, and obviously there is an economic analysis that sits under this as well. But what we've got is both a solution worked up for a number of railways with a detailed solution in certain countries, and then also a framework that will be published that allows railways to do their own analysis of the kind that we've done. So we've done the work demonstrated the capability, demonstrated the process for how you'd make these decisions, and then that will be then embedded in some guidelines that people can replicate in further studies. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Clive. Quite interesting, and we look forward to the actual trials of some of these technologies. Okay, our fourth presentation is a double act by Francis Mwangi and Esther Gachanja. Francis is Senior Planning Officer and CAP member for Kenya. Esther is the Principal Economist and Climate Change Coordinator also for the Kenyan government. They will be responding in particular, or at least discussing, the opportunity in Kenyan cities for investment in accessible and affordable modes of transport. We all believe that public transport is a critical component for the reduction of carbon emissions. However, is this feasible in the case of Kenya? And can all this be done whilst meeting needs for public transport to become climate resilient? So over to you. I don't know who is going to speak first, but since you have the mic, Francis.
Thank you, thank you. At this moment, we are also happy. I hope you have received. Yes. I hope you have received our presentation. Esther is going to do the presentation, then we shall join in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity. We are going to do a brief presentation and a lot of talking to address some of and to share some of the experiences in Kenya. We wanted to let you know that recently Kenya has removed subsidies for fuel, and this has led to a rise in the fuel cost. And once the fuel cost rises, in addition to the other factors that lead to fuel cost rise, definitely the cost of living goes high. And the cost of living is the transportation demands and needs are key and are almost basic because each day you have to move. So once the transport cost goes high, which obviously is dependent to the fuel cost, definitely the consumers and the common citizens are more affected. And as a ministry, we endeavor to provide efficient transportation system. That is our vision. And we are guided by a national integrated transport policy, which envisages efficient, affordable, and safe transportation system as our vision. And within it, we also know that a transport system cannot be efficient if it is not climate resilient, if it is not sustainable. Therefore, we also endeavor to ensure that the transport system is sustainable. And we know that majority of the investments are on the infrastructure development, whereby in Kenya there is a lot of potential because we are still developing to improve on our infrastructure for transport in all modes. The modes here, we talk of pipeline, we talk of air transport, we talk of rail transport, we talk of road transport, and we talk of the active mobility. And even sometimes we have for cargo, the non-motorized, we have things we call mukokotenis. So all those are several modes of transport. And therefore we believe that, and we agree with every argument that increase in investments in transport is likely to be beneficial to both the household economies and even the national economy, because like in Kenya, we have a vision 2030, and in that vision, transport is recognized as a key enabler to the realization of that vision, which aspires to make Kenya a middle-income country by 2030. And therefore, to also ensure that our transport system is efficient, we endeavor to do the seamless, to make it seamless interconnectivity. That currently is missing. There are a lot of missing links. And therefore, we feel if we increase investments along the interconnectivity, it can improve the efficiency. Because currently we find that investments are standalones. Aviation does, rail does, without connecting even to the walking pedestrians. So currently investments along the interconnectivity will improve even the economic growth of the country. And therefore we are saying that for all the modes, as we think along together and we build synergy such that there is a way of making the modes interconnect. We are also talking of improving the non-motorized transport, as I've said, because we have other modes of transportation which are not motorized. In Kenya, we also use donkeys in some places, and we also carry roads on our backs. So we need comfortable walkways and such like, and even cycling. As much as it is not culturally adopted, the in-then, we are trying to create awareness, and we have seen a rise in cyclings, using bicycles to work places, using bicycles to school. We have even initiatives to introduce faster and electrified bicycles, and we believe that all that will decarbonize transport in one way or another. So far, over several years, we have tried to create these non-motorized facilities, and we have 1,153 kilometers of the same. And in terms of regulation, as I've already mentioned, we have a national transport policy which regulates and guides the whole of transport sector for all the modes. And for the public service vehicles, the large and service transportation, we attempt to use self-regulation through use of PSV circles, where transport providers join a circle and they self-regulate. A pictorial of how Nairobi looks like. Nairobi is the capital city of Kenya. That is how we have many smaller occupancy vehicles. So also one of the aspiration is to increase the mass transit, to invest in BRTs. And we have a pilot in Thika Road, a highway we call Thika Road. We are piloting the BRT facility. We have even this is a terminal, an example of a terminal under construction in Thika Road to enhance bus rapid transit, to move masses from the smaller vehicles to higher occupancy vehicles. And we are doing all this with electrifying transport in mind. We have e-mobility initiatives, so many startups, so many regulatory frameworks coming up and under development just to increase e-mobility as a mitigation action, as a priority mitigation action, because it has a lot of potential. This is an electric bus recently launched in Kenya in October through a private initiative by Rome Rapid. And we have many more. If we had more time, we would give more scenarios, including the expressway from CBD all the way to Westlands in Kenya. It's a game changer in transportation, and one good example of a tolled highway in Kenya. Thank you. More we'll talk during questions. I would want to invite my colleague Francis, who is an aviator, to give us a small scenario of aviation, because as part of improving interconnectivity in Kenya, we intend to also interconnect through domestic flights. So I welcome him to give us a brief.
Thank you, Esther. Further to what she have said, we have done also in terms of decarbonizing the aviation. We did the study on sustainable aviation fuel, which we want to explore fuel in Kenya. So far, the study showed that we did, together with the CAO and the EU, the study on feasibility that there is potential to have fuel generation for Kenya, which can be used by motor vehicles and also for aviation. Recently, we did a workshop with GIZ in August, and we are still collaborating to see how we can make that a game changer, that we are able to, instead of using the fossil fuel, we use the sustainable aviation fuel, and also which in relation also to hydrogen. So I'm happy to see Prof. what he has said, that the hydrogen now, I think it's a good way we can also collaborate to see how we can use the sustainable, because the study showed waste that we are having, the municipal waste, which we are having along within Nairobi and other states, can be used to generate a lot of fuel, together with other materials, like we had issue of water hyacinth, which can be used, sugar cane bagasse can be used. The other item we have also done, we did Kenya, launched a carbon 2050 calculator, which we are using it. We did together with Imperial College and Strathmore University, which we have shown in terms of decarbonizing all these mode of transport, all of them, the key four of them. We need to use the calculator to be able to see, as we use all the new methodology we are saying in terms of electrification, improving the transport sector, we need to see how the emission will also achieve toward the 2050 neutral growth, such that we don't have emission increasing. So you have that calculator, is online. If you just Google a 2050 calculator for Kenya, you are able to see the emissions and how you are able to see how emissions are going to reduce until you can even go up to 2100. That's a key initiative. The other item we have done is issue of, in terms of aviation, we have installed solar power. If you come to one of the airport, in terms of Moi International Airport, the airport is 50% green. We are able to provide solar, which is solar at the gate. As the aircraft is parked, instead of using its own power or diesel-powered GPU, we are using solar. So you find there is that reduction in terms of emission. And since it was a pilot project done together with ICAO EU, we want now to launch a bigger project in Jomo Kenyatta International Airport of 3 megawatt, where we want now to ensure that there is that clean energy which is supplied within the infrastructure. And there is other measures we are doing also for other aviation in terms of improvement of air navigation, ensuring that there is seamless flight, like through collaboration with the military to ensure we release some of the airspace. Thank you, and then maybe we can engage more on the question. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all the presenters, and I want to particularly thank you for keeping up to time. So we do have enough time now for open discussion. As mentioned earlier, we have on Slido a number of questions that have been posed by the audience remotely. And if there are any questions here in the room, please either enter it in Slido or just raise your hands and we'll come to you. So the first one is a question, I guess, aimed at Bronwyn Thornton. A very easily made mistake. Sorry, apologies for that. There is an extreme climate crisis. What solutions can be delivered in this decade at the scale required across African cities that meets mobility needs, particularly for walking? Bronwyn.
Yes, thanks very much. No worries about my name. I've spent my life having it mispronounced, so no worries there. It is a critical question, and if I was representing cycling, which we do work very closely with cycling, I would actually be answering that one of those best investments can be implementation of safe space for people to ride bicycles, because bicycles offer the distance that walking cannot, and at the same time that low carbon solution. What I was really inspired by hearing from Kenya was the commitment to public transport and to the walking and the commuter catchments for that public transport. But these things do take time. But we have a cost of living crisis now. You take away government subsidies, everything goes up in price. We are already spending government money on subsidizing fossil fuel consumption to move ourselves around our cities. So why are we not putting that government money into localizing services so people can walk? You know, very often in Africa, that first mile is the only mile that people have to travel. So we don't always have to think in the biggest and the longest and the most expensive and the BRTs and this. How about we start looking at our land use planning, urbanize, put some urban some employment centres in different parts of our cities. Governments can make these choices. This is what Carlos's 15-minute city that Paris is adopting is all about. Instead of investing and subsidising fuels, let's give people the option not to spend their transport budgets on transport, their household budgets on transport, by governments making choices with their budgets to invest in local services, in infrastructure for low carbon modes, so that people have the choice to move safely and actively around their cities. Because as much as we all talk about choice, as soon as you get the levels of motorization or the poor infrastructure like we see across Africa, you are denying the choice of the people who need it the most, or who could value actually wanting to just work, live, and take their children to school locally. I know the land use planning thing is a bigger thing, but those quick interventions to enable low-cost travel is a real thing that could happen and sustain the share of walking and increase the share of cycling this decade.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. A follow-up question is really, how can one leverage large investments from development banks towards walking, given the fact that most of these use cost-benefit analysis to justify investments?
One of my favorite topics. This is something I'm working on so much at the moment because I'm tired of hearing walking priced out of cost-benefit analysis. We have to revisit the way we actually benefit and do those cost benefits. What are those fiscal appraisal systems that are ruling out these benefits? Why are we, as a government, because it's not the banks ultimately, it is the national governments who have budgets across health, urban development, transport, why are they not reaching across all of those benefits to inform their investment decisions and bring those to offset against the costs that are required for this? But that's those broader benefits. But the simple transport benefits, the congestion reduction, your customer base is your walking population. So public transport investments, when multilateral development banks are spending money on public transport, it must not be just the buses and the stations or the tracks and the trains. It must be those commuter catchments as well. We have the economic arguments that say if you improve commuter catchments, if you make it safer and more direct for people to walk and cycle to your stations and your stops, you get better ridership on your public transport. If we value that journey, that 500 meters, make that quality, not just proximity to public transport, then we will get a better fiscal return on those investments in public transport. That's a no-brainer. That's a direct line. Road projects must include walking and cycling infrastructure every time we do a road project. Don't tell me it's a motorway and therefore they shouldn't be there. Most of those roads in Africa still have people walking on them, and we should be making it safe. And if you want to offset those costs, let's measure the impact of the road safety data and the costs of people dying in those spaces, and put those into our cost-benefit analysis for transport projects, even before we get to health and air quality and all the rest of it.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. I certainly agree with you that if we do include cost of lives that are lost due to the conflict between motorized and non-motorized, then surely that should be the basis for economic justification, if one is needed. The message from you is that you should be able to do without even having to look at the deaths to justify provision of facilities for those who are non-motorized. Now, Gary and Romanus, how do you cope with different opinions or conflicting opinions when you do your consultations? Are project promoters listening to the feedback from a participatory process?
Thank you. I think it's an excellent question. One of the approaches we use was the deliberative approaches, where the aim is to gain consensus. So there's different rounds that you ask people the same question again, like 3 times, and then you're able to see the opinion of others, and you come to find those commonalities. But you're right, there's an issue of the power balance as well between let's say the planners, and especially representative disadvantaged groups. And I think it's demonstrating the potential benefits of some of these approaches by having more quality information, more local knowledge. And then, I don't know, Romanos has been involved much more on the ground with some of these projects, whether he wants to add anything.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks, Prof, for that. Yeah, in terms of looking at the placemaking, where we had initial concerns by the business community, they thought that when you bring more workers, they are going to lose business. But when you demonstrate in terms of how they can gain with that, then they start buying in the process. By just doing a test for one day, and they saw the difference in terms of the quality, how people are walking around, how people can now shop without being harassed or being the hooting and even the noise pollution and others. So it's just a matter of making it practical so they can able to relate with the reality associated with that particular benchmark or particular intervention. Yeah, thank you.
Very much, Clive. There's a question here for you. Given the time frames for procurement and all other activities that are needed for rail transport as a whole, how optimistic are you, and when can we expect these systems to be functional?
Yeah, that's a good question. In any kind of infrastructure project, the procurement and process specification and procurement process is very long. I think in terms of what we're trying to do here in the work that we're doing is to firstly get some of those alternative solutions actually on the table so people are actually thinking about them. And I think we're making good inroads in that area, and we will continue to do so. The framework and guidelines that we will produce as part of this project will enable people to, who perhaps aren't experienced in some of these areas, to pick those up and actually then start getting these options considered. So that's statement number one. In terms of the potential to retrofit, we've proven actually for our own projects that this can be done very quickly from a technical point of view. So actually the engineering works to produce that first train that we demonstrated at COP26 only actually took a year. So there is actually the potential to undertake some of that work really very quickly within the space of a few years to get to make that step move from existing rolling stock, which is perhaps at midlife, high levels of polluting, to something that is zero carbon or near zero carbon in a relatively quick time window, and at a relatively low cost compared with complete replacement. As soon as you enter into the cycle of actually building new railways or procuring entirely new vehicle fleets, then there is a long time period. But nonetheless, this is really important to do, because if we don't intervene in the way that we're intervening at the moment, what we'll end up with is just the existing technology rolled on for another 50 years. So we do need to, this is vitally important to do.
Very much. Let me go to Francis and Esther. As a follow-up question, and also coming on Slido, is there need for more government regulation? In some parts of the world, there is belief there should be less regulation. But from your experience and from your practical work, to what extent can government regulation help towards the transition of low-carbon transport?
Thank you. Let me start. In terms of government regulation, they are good, provided they are there is that awareness. Because the main problem we are finding with this regulation, even the regulation exists, but people, are they following? Then the main problem is that there is that need to be able to have them. There is need for awareness, and also to help to reduce the regulation. There is also that need of creating awareness to the general public. Like the way you have seen those, the walkway being made, you find still people coming to put a selling point where it's supposed to be cycling. You find other mode of, or other uses. So there is that need, as we even make regulation, make the public also aware of the need of this infrastructure. And with that, we shall go toward reducing the regulation, because there will be self-regulation within the people or the public. Let me give my colleague.
Yes. Thank you. I concur with my colleague. In our country, there is a culture of low compliance with existing laws and regulation, and therefore, if they are absent, we wonder how it would be. So there is need to try, I don't know how we can change the culture, but just to make people just to be self-disciplined, to just do the right thing at the right place. And I also think regulation is also required because of technology. JAM has been mentioned. We need to ensure standards, because if there are no standard, there are no regulation, you'll find infiltration of every kind of product into the economy. And we are also thinking, even as we are trying to improve and introduce e-mobility, we are thinking as a developing country and a chief importer of vehicles, for example, and the first world, sorry to say, are moving ahead and even stopping production. So we avoid a situation where we can find like all the ones that are being left for better technology are brought to us, and us when we are ready now to take off, we have a lot which we don't even know how to dispose. So regulation for us is still important.
Thank you very much. And this is more an open question to all the panelists. We know that there is significant poverty throughout Africa, but particularly in the urban areas. There's poverty in terms of very low incomes, and there's poverty in terms of lack of facilities. The infrastructure, governments, or the city governments in particular, are also poor to some extent because they don't have revenues. So what do you think in these circumstances are the best options for urban areas to adopt more mobility-friendly transport policies and actions, where the governments on the one hand do not have the facilities, but on the other hand, the users are also poor and therefore cannot afford more expensive modes of transport? Let me go first to Bronwyn, because I think you've got the answer, we believe, but over to you.
I'm going to have to apologize. I missed the essence of the question because I was reading a new one that came up on Slido addressed directly to me. It distracted me at the critical moment. Please repeat the question.
Okay, the essence of the question is that the two sides of the coin are both poor. The users don't have enough funds to be able to afford more expensive forms of transport. On the other hand, city governments are also poor. They don't have the revenues and the financing to provide the kind of facilities that we are talking about. So what is the low-hanging fruit here? How can we start to implement?
Well, you already have it with the levels of walking. And retaining localized services so that people can choose walking and don't have to invest more of their household budgets, and governments don't have to invest in road infrastructure. That when you do cost-benefit analysis of road infrastructure on broader benefits, not just transport benefits or traditional transport models, they just don't win anymore. I mean, when World Health did their first health economic assessment tool for walking and cycling, it blew transport CBAs out of the water, so much so that transport professionals couldn't cope and said, we can't use that. It's just, so we have to reframe all of those things. But meanwhile, let's go out and make the streets safer. Tactical urbanism is immediate and successful way. Let's temporarily, if necessary, just reclaim that space, make it safer, make it nicer for people, and enable local services. I know in South Africa, in Cape Town, those suburban landscapes that are totally motor-centric got caught with COVID because they weren't allowed to travel even to buy food. They had to change the rules to allow food carts into suburban areas. So let's think more creatively. Let's not just think about the movement and the mobility, but about the motivations, the origins and the destinations, and how we can enable people to move and at low cost local opportunities.
Thank you very much. Gary and Romanus, over to you in terms of to what extent are for example, the reference guides that you talked about, to what extent are these being adopted by the authorities to implement the kind of activities that you're promoting?
I think we're at the, would say, the emerging stage. We're at an early stage. There are a number of projects. We've piloted these approaches, and we've had good results. But I think we're still at the stage of raising awareness, we did some capacity building. So it's a process that's just at the beginning. And I believe that we need to, and with the step with the guidance document, is to try and show planners as well as representatives of disadvantaged groups the benefits of taking these approaches and how it's done. So I think we're at an early stage. I think it's going to take a while, but we're making a step forward. And yeah, I don't know if Romanos would like to add anything from his experience.
Thanks, Gary, for that. I think my additional contribution to that is that, like for example, Kenya now we have the government is declaring the informal settlements as special planning area, where you can have negotiated standards first to improve mobility within the slums or the informal settlement, but secondly, and more importantly, to sustain also the livelihood in terms of negotiated space, so they can have space for traders, but also space for pedestrians. These are negotiated standards so that we are able to match the two. You don't kill the businesses, but also we also enhance mobility within this particular area. So I think in terms of coming up with the local standards, which takes into account the local context, then we're able to negotiate using these approaches to see which one is feasible and which one can they go in terms of minimalists to enhance livelihoods, but also to enhance mobility and safety within the poor informal settlements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Clive, let me come to you in terms of the hydrogen-powered locomotives and others, the traction systems rather. How expensive do you see this being in future, and how will that compare with hydropower, as is probably the most abundant in most African countries? And the final question that's come through on this, when will we see the actual implementation?
Right, so the cost for electrifying railways comes from two parts. One is the power generation itself, and the other is actually the distribution infrastructure that the railway needs. And the kind of analysis that we do around the world is looking at where that cost benefit lies. And roughly, and it's very roughly, but a good rule of thumb is that if you stand on the side of a railway and you don't see a train come past you every 15 minutes, you probably can't afford to electrify it. But that's to do with the railway infrastructure rather than the power supply. In Africa, we have both problems. We have the lack of infrastructure and the long distances, and then the actual power system itself. So there are certainly benefits to be had by some of the other alternative power solutions that Africa may offer. However, that doesn't negate the cost of the railway infrastructure in itself. And that, just to give you an idea, in Europe, that's around £2 million per kilometre. It's cheaper in India. I think India's delivering this at about £200,000 or £300,000, equate with dollars at the moment, per kilometre. So this just isn't cheap in general. In terms of then things actually happening, as I said before, some of this can happen quite quickly, and it's a good solution. This investment in railways is going ahead anyway. We want to make sure that it's a low carbon investment rather than a high carbon investment. And if I may, I'd just perhaps pick up on, I'm not the most obvious person to answer the previous question, but just to pick up on the previous question. In a number of places around the world, railways are being invested in as freight corridors, but they're acting as standalone corridors. And we've observed that to happen around the world. So Brazil's a really good example where there's lots of freight railways. And learning from those other countries, what we're seeing is that there's a move to push to make sure that when those concessions are given, they're encouraged to also carry passengers as well. So that can be a low-cost option to do that, and also can rapidly achieve some of those things. The other things that do exist, and I'm doing work in Jamaica at the moment, which is really interesting, around reopening parts of the railway there, where there's actually historically a large amount of infrastructure that has more or less just been mothballed. And that project started as buying a new railway from outside of the country, and is now turning into a project about local developing local skills, and an on-the-ground workforce, developing skills and jobs, and also working in local communities. So there are some, railways are seen as an expensive thing to do, and they are, but actually there are some things that you can do to get some rapid benefits at low cost.
Thank you very much, Clive. Let me come now to Francis and Esther. A question that is often forefront in the public mind in terms of regulation of public transport and, of course, enforcement of that regulation. In Nairobi, as you've mentioned, there's quite a few of the borders, or these are motorbike passenger services, and also the matatus. These are the minibuses who are often accused of having the worst traffic behavior. How do you enforce and ensure that these modes of transport that are perhaps quite essential do comply with the regulation, and from that become a positive for public transport in a city like Nairobi?
Thank you. As I mentioned, we utilize and we adopt self-regulation, whereby these providers join in group, where they try to instill that discipline, that self-instilled need to comply with the existing law, as well as trying even to make them understand what the law says. Because as we know, these categories of people are also people who depend on others to interpret for them the law, what the law means. When you tell somebody to wear a helmet, for example, why? He doesn't see the need, but you and me know that if the skull is harmed, the whole self is gone. So we intend to strengthen that institution, because that's a cell that works even for as an economic unit, the self-regulation groups. Thank you.
Maybe in addition, what we can also do is that most of, as we develop those infrastructure, that we are having those mass rapid, we ensure that those motorcycles, they serve the last mile, instead of all of them congesting within the city center through proper urban planning. Because the problem you find everyone is coming there is because there is no that interconnectivity. But when you have proper urban planning, that we find that the last mile, those matatus, and they serve the last mile, instead of all of them coming within the city center, but they can maybe carry people toward the last mile outside the city. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our presenters, and also particularly to those online, because I know it's not necessarily the most convenient way of doing it, but thank you all. We are bang on time, so to speak, so another kudos to our presenters for really keeping up to time and for the great substance of your presentations. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you.